The city cafe buzzed with its usual afternoon energy. Angela Parker sat outside, basking in the warmth of the sun as it kissed her skin. Her cappuccino remained untouched on the table, the creamy foam swirling in a perfect pattern under the sunlight. She tapped away on her phone, scrolling through emails with half-hearted attention, her focus divided between the screen and the lively hum of the bustling street. At first, she didn't notice the three men approaching. Their laughter blended seamlessly with the ambient noise, the clinking of cups, snippets of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter from nearby tables. It wasn't until their voices grew more distinct, louder and closer, that Angela glanced up. The trio walked casually down the sidewalk, their movements relaxed but purposeful. Leading them was a tall, lean man whose sharp grin matched the predatory gleam in his eyes as they scanned his surroundings. Following slightly behind him was a blond man, a scar etched along his jawline, and a stocky individual in a worn hoodie. Their expressions hinted at trouble, but Angela dismissed the thought, her attention drifting back to her phone. The cafe was crowded, with families, couples, and groups of friends scattered across the patio. She wasn't alone, she reminded herself, though a vague unease began to gnaw at the edges of her thoughts. The scrape of chairs against the pavement drew her gaze upward once more. The three men had stopped, now hovering near her table. The tall man's grin widened as he looked at her, and then at the vacant seats surrounding her. "Lovely day, isn't it?" he said, his tone casual, almost disarming. Angela responded with a faint nod, her lips forming a tight, polite smile. She didn't speak, hoping they would take the hint and move along. They didn't. "Mind if we join you?" he asked, already pulling out a chair before she could answer. The blond man laughed, a mocking sound that grated against her nerves. Why bother asking her? She doesn't care. The words stung more than she expected, but Angela remained composed. Her eyes darted to the cafe entrance, searching for a waiter or someone who might intervene. None of the staff seemed to notice. "Relax," the tall one said, leaning back in the chair he'd claimed. "We're just being friendly, right, guys?" Angela forced a strained smile, her instincts urging her to stay calm. Her unease deepened as she realized no one around them appeared to be paying attention. "We'll just hang out here for a bit," the blonde added, his tone dripping with mockery. "You don't mind, do you?" Angela's pulse quickened, but she stayed silent, unwilling to provoke them further. She gripped her coffee cup tightly, its ceramic warmth grounding her against the growing discomfort. The tall man, Greg, as she would soon learn, studied her with an unsettling mix of amusement and calculation. His eyes wandered across her belongings, lingering on her purse as if he were assessing a prize. His companions, Ryan and Paul, mirrored his smug demeanor, their presence an unspoken challenge to anyone who might think to interfere. "You don't seem like you're from around here," Greg remarked, his tone light but laced with a taunting edge. "What brings you to this part of town?" Angela hesitated, unsure how to respond. She glanced toward the cafe door again, silently pleading for someone to notice. Still, no one did. "Just getting coffee," she replied finally, her voice steady though quieter than she intended. Greg's grin widened, his expression both patronizing and predatory. "Coffee, huh? Seems like a pretty fancy bag for just a quick coffee stop." Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Bet she's got some interesting stuff in there," he said, nodding toward her purse. Instinctively, Angela pulled her bag closer. "It's just a bag," she said quickly, trying to mask the tension in her voice. "Relax," Ryan said, chuckling as he leaned back again. "We're just curious. No need to get all jumpy." Paul, the stockier of the three, snickered. "She's acting like we're gonna rob her or something." The casual comment sent a chill down Angela's spine. She looked around again, her heart pounding as she searched for a sympathetic face in the sea of oblivious patrons. Greg leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. His smirk shifted into something colder, more menacing. "You seem nervous, Angela." Her breath caught. He knew her name. She hadn't told them, but they must have overheard it when she ordered her drink. "I'm not nervous," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Greg chuckled, a low, sinister sound echoed by his friends. "Sure you're not," he said mockingly. Ryan reached across the table, tapping the untouched coffee cup in front of her. Still hasn't taken a sip. What's the matter? Not thirsty? Angela pushed the cup aside, her unease reaching a breaking point. Leave me alone, she said, her voice firmer now, but still edged with fear. Greg straightened in his seat, his gaze hardening. We're just getting started, he said smoothly. He motioned to Ryan, who stood and moved closer, cutting off her escape route to the cafe door. Paul circled behind her, boxing her in. Angela's breathing quickened. Her palms were slick with sweat, but she refused to show them the fear they were trying to provoke. When Greg reached for her purse, she instinctively pulled it back. "Don't touch my things!" she snapped, her voice rising. Greg's smirk faltered briefly, but then he recovered, his demeanor even more condescending. "Feisty," he said, the mockery dripping from his words. "I like that." Paul laughed, a coarse, unpleasant sound. "Looks like she's got some fight in her. Maybe we should stick around." Angela's heart thundered in her chest as she met Greg's gaze. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "Leave me alone." Greg's grin returned, colder than before. "We'll leave," he said slowly, his tone dripping with menace, "but not before we have a little fun." He snatched the purse from her lap. Angela lunged for it, but Greg was quicker, pulling it out of her reach with a triumphant sneer. "Calm down," Greg said, his voice laced with mock amusement, as he casually unzipped Angela's bag. "We're just taking a peek." Angela shot up from her seat, the harsh scrape of her chair against the pavement drawing attention from nearby patrons. "Give it back," she demanded, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. Ryan stepped forward, his hand pushing against her shoulder lightly but firmly, forcing her back into the chair. "Sit down, sweetheart. No need to make a scene," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Angela's words caught in her throat as her eyes darted around, desperately searching for someone, anyone, to step in. The surrounding patrons glanced her way, but quickly turned back to their conversations, uncertain whether to intervene or stay out of it. Greg rifled through her purse with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. He pulled out her wallet, holding it up with a mocking grin. "Well, what do we have here?" he mused before tossing it to Ryan. Catching it effortlessly, Ryan flipped the wallet open with one hand and let out a low whistle. "Looks like someone's doing pretty well for herself," he said, flashing a smug grin in Angela's direction. A wave of humiliation and helpless fury washed over Angela. Her eyes stung with unshed tears, but she swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but her instincts screamed at her to stay composed. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "Just take the money and go." Greg chuckled, his smirk growing wider as he tossed the bag to Paul, who immediately began rummaging through it. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Paul said, with a satisfied grunt as he pulled out a pair of sunglasses. "We'll be out of your hair soon enough." Greg's eyes landed on the delicate bracelet adorning Angela's wrist. He reached for it, but Angela instinctively yanked her arm back. Ah, Greg said, his tone suddenly cold and sharp. "Don't make me ask twice." Angela hesitated, her hands trembling as she struggled with the clasp. Finally, she handed over the bracelet, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her like a stone. Greg pocketed it with a self-satisfied grin. "Good girl," he sneered, motioning to his companions. The three men turned to leave, their laughter cutting through the air as they congratulated themselves. Greg tossed the bracelet into the air and caught it, playing with it as though it were a cheap trinket. Angela collapsed back into her chair, her body racked with tremors of fear and rage. Around her, the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the incident seemingly forgotten by everyone but her. As the gang strolled away, their laughter echoing down the sidewalk, Angela sat frozen in place. Her trembling hands rested on the table, her mind a storm of emotions. She barely noticed the familiar voice calling her name until it cut through the haze. "Angela!" Her head snapped up, her father's commanding figure emerging from the cafe entrance. James Parker's presence was like a beacon of safety and authority. His sharp gaze swept over her, taking in her pale complexion and trembling form. "Dad," Angela whispered, her voice weak and full of relief, mingled with shame. James's eyes narrowed as he crouched slightly, his tone urgent but calm. "What happened?" he asked. Angela looked down at the table, unable to meet his eyes. "They took my purse and my bracelet," she said quietly. James's expression hardened. His jaw clenched as his eyes locked onto the retreating figures of the gang. Without hesitation, he straightened and issued a firm command. "Stay here." "Dad, don't—" Angela began. But James was already moving. His stride was purposeful, each step exuding the authority of a man who had seen far worse and emerged unshaken. The gang had just rounded the corner when James's deep, commanding voice rang out. "Hey!" The three men stopped in their tracks, turning to face him. Their laughter faded, replaced by wary amusement as they sized him up. Greg's smirk returned, though it wavered slightly under James's steely gaze. "Well, would you look at this?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The cavalry's arrived." James stopped a few feet away from them, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. "Hand over what you took," he said evenly, his voice calm but unyielding. Greg raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "Took? We didn't take anything, old man," he replied, feigning innocence. "Don't lie to me," James said, his voice carrying the unmistakable edge of authority. "My daughter told me everything. Now give it back." Ryan snorted, shaking his head. "Looks like Daddy's here to save the day," he said with a sneer. Paul crossed his arms, his grin smug. "What are you gonna do, Grandpa? Call the cops?" James didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Greg. "You have one chance to do the right thing. Give it back and walk away." Greg stepped forward, his smirk widening into a challenge. "Or what?" James didn't back down, his calm exterior unshaken. "You don't want to find out." For a moment, the air was thick with tension. The surrounding noise of the street seemed to dim as a few bystanders started to notice the confrontation. Murmurs began to ripple through the growing crowd. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got guts, old man. But see, we don't take orders. Especially not from someone like you," he gestured to his friends. "Let's go." As they turned to leave, James's voice sliced through the air with cutting precision. "Cowards." The single word hung in the air like a challenge. The gang froze mid-step. Greg turned slowly, his smirk now replaced with a glare. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," James said, his tone as steady as a rock. "You think you're tough, ganging up on a woman sitting alone? Stealing from her? That's not tough. That's pathetic." Ryan's confident expression wavered slightly, but Greg's anger flared. He stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You've got a big mouth for someone outnumbered." James didn't blink. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched. James's posture remained steady, his demeanor calm yet alert, as if waiting for the inevitable. "Do you really want to test me?" he asked, his voice carrying an air of quiet authority. Greg's grin twisted into a sneer, and he stepped closer, the confidence in his stride unshaken. "Oh, I think I do." The atmosphere was electric, every sound around them muted as the confrontation reached a boiling point. Time seemed to stretch, the standoff feeling endless though it lasted mere seconds. James stood unwavering, his eyes fixed on Greg with a piercing gaze. Meanwhile, Greg toyed with Angela's bracelet, tossing it from hand to hand like a prize. Murmurs from the onlookers grew louder, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension spreading through the crowd. Angela's pulse hammered in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. Her father's composed yet unyielding stance was a stark contrast to the charged tension filling the air. She knew the depth of his Navy SEAL training and what he was capable of, but she also understood he wouldn't escalate the situation unless absolutely necessary. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to rise. "Dad, stop!" she called out, her voice trembling but firm. She hurried forward, placing herself between him and Greg, her hands pressed against his chest as she tried to hold him back. "It's not worth it. Let them go." James's eyes softened as he looked at her, the steely determination in his expression giving way to concern. "Angela," he said gently, "they stole from you. They disrespected you." "I know," she replied, her voice cracking with emotion, "but this isn't the way. Please." Her eyes searched his, pleading for him to let it go. James exhaled slowly, the tension in his body easing, his fists unclenched, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go." Relief washed over Angela as she stepped back, preparing to guide him away. But before they could move, Greg's voice sliced through the air, loud and venomous. "Yeah, that's right," he sneered, his tone dripping with malice. "Walk away, just like the cowards you people always are." The words hit like a slap. Angela froze, her blood running cold. James halted mid-step, his shoulders stiffening as he let out a slow, controlled breath. Greg's mocking laughter followed. "What's the matter, old man? Too scared to stand up for your little girl?" Angela's grip tightened on her father's arm. "Dad, don't!" she whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. But James was already turning back, his expression calm yet resigned, as though he had anticipated this outcome all along. "You just couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you?" James said, his tone dangerously even. Greg spread his arms wide, feigning innocence. "What? I'm just saying it like it is." Ryan and Paul exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence faltering as James stepped closer. "I gave you every opportunity to walk away," James said, his voice steady as a rock. "Now, you'll regret not taking it." Greg's smirk wavered, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Big words, old man. Let's see if you can back them up." In a flash, the tension snapped. James moved with the precision of a coiled spring, his fist connecting with Greg's jaw before the gang leader could even react. The blow sent Greg stumbling backward, his arrogant grin replaced by a look of shock. Ryan lunged at James from the side, but James sidestepped with ease, grabbing Ryan's arm and twisting it behind his back. Ryan cried out in pain as James shoved him toward Paul, who barely managed to catch him. Greg recovered quickly, rage contorting his features. He charged at James, swinging wildly, but James ducked beneath the strike and countered with a swift punch to the gut. Greg doubled over, gasping for air. "Stop him!" Greg barked, his voice strained. Paul hesitated, his eyes darting nervously, but then rushed forward with a clumsy punch. James caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it sharply. Paul yelped, dropping to one knee as pain flashed across his face. Angela stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. Her father, though outnumbered, moved with an efficiency and confidence that left no doubt he was in control. Every movement was precise, every strike deliberate. Greg, now seething with fury, pulled a small blade from his pocket. The knife glinted in the sunlight, drawing a gasp from the crowd. "Dad!" Angela screamed, her voice breaking as panic surged through her. James's eyes flicked to the knife, his body tensing in response. When Greg lunged at him, James sidestepped once again, grabbing Greg's wrist and slamming it against the edge of a table. The knife clattered to the ground with a metallic clang. Ryan scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with anger. "You're dead, old man!" he shouted, charging at James. James turned swiftly, grabbing Ryan by the front of his shirt and shoving him back into Paul. The two men stumbled, barely regaining their balance as Greg barked orders at them. "Take him down!" Greg snarled, clutching his side as he tried to rally his companions. The fight escalated as Ryan and Paul worked together to corner James. Greg joined in, swinging wildly, but his punches barely grazed James, who ducked and delivered a punishing kick to Greg's knee. Greg crumpled to the ground with a grunt of pain. Despite the gang's numbers, it was clear they were no match for James's skill and experience. Angela's heart pounded as she watched her father fight with the calculated precision of someone who had spent years in combat. Greg struggled to his feet, his hatred for James burning in his glare. "You'll pay for this!" he spat, lunging at him once more. James sidestepped with practiced ease, delivering a blow to Greg's ribs that sent him crashing into a nearby table. Ryan and Paul hesitated, their confidence wavering as they exchanged uncertain glances. The crowd gasped as the fight raged on, tables and chairs toppling over in the chaos. Despite their desperation, the gang's every attempt to overpower James failed. Onlookers edged back, too stunned or afraid to intervene, as the scene unfolded before them. Angela stood frozen at the edge of the fray, her hands gripping the edge of a table as she watched her father dominate the confrontation. His movements were a seamless blend of grace and force, each strike a testament to his training. James's stance remained solid, his body language projecting calm readiness. His sharp eyes flickered between the men surrounding him, reading every movement before they acted. "You really want to go through with this?" he asked, his tone steady and unwavering. Greg sneered, stepping closer, his earlier bravado barely concealing his desperation. "Oh, I'm ready." The tension on the patio was palpable, every sound around them fading into a heavy silence. The confrontation had drawn a captivated audience, murmurs rippling through the growing crowd. The gang spread out, encircling James, with Ryan and Paul flanking him as Greg kept a watchful distance. James's sharp gaze darted between them, anticipating their moves before they struck. Ryan lunged first, his punch wild and poorly aimed. James moved fluidly, sidestepping and twisting Ryan's arm with calculated precision. The younger man let out a cry of pain as he was forced to the ground, clutching his shoulder as it collided with the hard pavement. Paul took the opening, rushing forward with all his weight behind a heavy swing. James deflected the blow with his forearm, the impact reverberating but failing to faze him. In one seamless motion, James countered with an elbow strike to Paul's jaw, sending him stumbling into a nearby toppled table. Greg barked orders, his frustration spilling into his voice. "Get up, you idiots!" Ryan struggled to his feet, cradling his injured arm, while Paul staggered upright, his movements sluggish. Despite their obvious disadvantage, the two men advanced again, their bruised pride overriding any sense of caution. Meanwhile, Greg circled behind James, his eyes scanning for an opportunity to strike. Angela's gaze locked on Greg, her heart sinking as she realized he had picked up a broken chair leg from the wreckage. "Dad! Behind you!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the noise. James turned just in time to block the swing. The jagged wood splintered against his forearm, the blow stinging but failing to break his composure. He seized the improvised weapon from Greg's grip with a swift motion, snapping it over his knee and tossing the broken pieces aside. "You're done," James said, his voice cold and final. Greg took a step back, his earlier arrogance now replaced by hesitation. His lips curled into a sneer, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat. James didn't reply. His silence, paired with his commanding presence, was more intimidating than any threat. Ryan and Paul exchanged wary glances, their confidence faltering as James stepped toward Greg. "You've got two choices," James said, his voice low and steady. "Leave now, or keep going and regret it." Greg's sneer wavered, his bravado struggling to mask his fear. "We're not scared of you," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the truth. Ryan shifted nervously, wiping the blood from his lip. "Maybe we should just go, Greg," he muttered under his breath. "Shut up!" Greg snapped, his glare cutting toward his companion. James took another deliberate step forward, his focus unbroken. "Make your choice," he said, the authority in his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The crowd watched in tense silence as Greg hesitated, looking around at the faces now fixated on him. His options were dwindling, escape routes narrowing with every passing second. The weight of his bruised ego and the judgmental stares of the onlookers were almost too much to bear. With a frustrated yell, he charged at James one last time. James sidestepped with the precision of a seasoned fighter, delivering a sharp kick to Greg's knee that sent him crashing to the ground. Ryan and Paul hesitated for a split second before launching themselves at James in a desperate bid to overpower him. James met their attack head-on, his movements a blur of efficiency and control. Grabbing Ryan by the front of his shirt, James drove a knee into his midsection, leaving him gasping for breath as he crumpled to the pavement. Paul swung wildly, but James intercepted the blow with a block and countered with a swift jab to Paul's temple, throwing him off balance. Within moments, all three men were on the ground, groaning in pain and clutching their injuries. The patio fell silent except for the labored breaths of the defeated gang. James stood tall, his breathing steady, his expression calm but resolute. His voice carried over the murmurs of the crowd as he addressed them one last time. "You had your chance." He stepped back, his sharp gaze shifting to Angela. "Are you okay?" Angela nodded, her legs shaky beneath her but holding. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling. She hesitated, glancing toward the fallen gang. "But what about them?" Greg, still sprawled on the ground, glared up at James with hatred burning in his eyes. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice hoarse and filled with venom. "You'll pay for this." James didn't flinch. His steady gaze pinned Greg in place as he replied, "We'll see." The sound of sirens cut through the tension, the rising wail signaling the approach of law enforcement. The crowd stirred, whispers of relief and apprehension rippling through the onlookers. "Cops are coming," someone muttered, and Greg's expression shifted from fury to panic. Ryan and Paul exchanged nervous glances, clearly understanding the consequences looming over them. James placed a steadying hand on Angela's shoulder, guiding her closer to him. "Stay with me," he said firmly. The gang scrambled to their feet, their earlier bravado replaced by desperation. "We need to get out of here," Ryan hissed, his gaze darting between the crowd and the approaching sound of sirens. "Let's go, Greg," Paul urged, his voice edged with fear. "It's not worth it." Greg hesitated, the sting of humiliation and bruised pride holding him back. With a final glare at James, he spat on the ground near his feet and turned to flee, Ryan and Paul following closely behind as they shoved through the crowd. James turned to Angela, his expression softening as he addressed her. "It's over now," he said quietly, though the weight of what had happened lingered in his eyes. Angela watched helplessly as James gave her a reassuring nod, before turning on his heel and breaking into a purposeful jog after the fleeing men. The chase spilled into the bustling streets, the gang darting between pedestrians and weaving through cars in a frantic bid to escape. Greg led the way, his movements erratic but determined, his mind racing for a way out. "They're not gonna catch us," Greg panted, throwing a quick glance over his shoulder. "Just keep moving." Ryan, trailing slightly behind, glanced back as well, his expression twisting with frustration. "He's still coming," he cursed under his breath. James pursued them with measured precision, his movements calculated and deliberate. He didn't waste energy. Years of rigorous Navy SEAL training had honed his ability to outlast and outmaneuver. He was conserving his strength, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Greg abruptly veered into a shadowy alley, gesturing for his crew to follow. The narrow passage was cluttered with dumpsters and abandoned crates, its dim lighting offering the illusion of safety. "Here!" Greg hissed, ducking behind a stack of crates. "We'll lose him here." Ryan and Paul collapsed against the alley walls, their breaths ragged and labored. Paul's voice trembled as he asked, "You sure this'll work?" Greg sneered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Of course it will. The old man's probably ready to keel over by now." Their brief relief evaporated when a shadow appeared at the entrance of the alley. James's silhouette was sharp against the dimming light, his presence unwavering as he stepped into view. His steady, deliberate stride sent a ripple of panic through the gang. "You picked the wrong alley," James said, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Ryan and Paul exchanged wide-eyed glances, their earlier confidence unraveling. Greg, however, stepped forward, attempting to mask his fear with false bravado. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" he snarled. "You should have just let us go." James stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed, yet ready. "And let you pull this on someone else?" he asked, shaking his head. "Not a chance." Greg's sneer deepened. "You're outnumbered, old man. You really want to do this?" James's sharp gaze shifted to Ryan and Paul, who hesitated, their nerves written plainly on their faces. "Looks like your backup's having second thoughts," James said, his tone razor-sharp. "Shut up!" Greg barked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Get him!" After a beat of hesitation, Ryan and Paul surged forward. Their clumsy, uncoordinated attack was no match for James's honed instincts. He sidestepped Ryan's poorly aimed swing, delivering a precise blow to his ribs that sent him sprawling to the ground. Paul lunged next, but James deflected the attack and countered with a sharp elbow strike to the side of Paul's head. Paul staggered, his balance failing as he collapsed. Greg's confidence faltered as he watched his companions fall. James turned to face him, his voice low and dangerous. "This is your last chance. Surrender now, or it's going to get worse for you." Greg's fists clenched, his jaw tightening in defiance. "Screw you!" he spat, rushing at James with all the force he could muster. James dodged Greg's wild swing effortlessly, countering with a series of precise strikes. A solid punch to the gut left Greg gasping for air, and a sweeping kick to his legs sent him crashing to the ground. He writhed in pain, clutching his stomach as he struggled to breathe. Ryan and Paul remained where they had fallen, groaning weakly but making no effort to rise. Greg, however, pushed himself to his knees, glaring at James with unbridled fury. You don't know who you're messing with," he wheezed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. James crouched down, his icy stare locking onto Greg. "I know exactly who you are," he said. "A coward who preys on the defenseless. That ends here." Greg's expression twisted with rage. But before he could respond, the distant wail of sirens began to grow louder. Red and blue lights flickered at the edge of the alley, their glow reflecting off the walls. The sound of footsteps and radio chatter signaled the arrival of the police. James straightened, stepping back as uniformed officers poured into the narrow alley. He motioned toward the gang sprawled on the ground. "These men have stolen property on them, and plenty to answer for." The officers moved quickly, securing the gang with handcuffs and checking them for weapons. Greg, Ryan, and Paul glared at James with smoldering hatred as they were restrained. "This isn't over," Greg muttered, his voice barely audible as an officer pulled him to his feet. James's gaze snapped to him, reading the tension in Greg's body like a book. He caught the subtle shift in Greg's posture, the slight lean that signaled his intent to lunge. "Don't," James warned, his voice cold and commanding. But Greg didn't listen. With a burst of energy, he shoved past the officer and sprinted toward the alley's far exit. "Stop him!" James barked, immediately moving to pursue. Ryan and Paul, emboldened by Greg's escape, scrambled to their feet. Paul shoved a nearby dumpster into James's path, forcing him to sidestep. Ryan charged, his movements clumsy but determined. James deflected Ryan with practiced precision, using his momentum to send him crashing into the wall. Ryan slumped to the ground, groaning in pain. The brief scuffle cost James precious seconds. Greg was already halfway down the alley, his frantic movements carrying him farther away. James pushed forward, dispatching Paul with a quick strike to the chest that left him wheezing on the ground. By the time James cleared the obstacles, Greg had vanished into the night. Around the corner, the flashing lights of police cruisers painted the alley in harsh red and blue hues as officers arrived on the scene. Their voices rang out, commanding and authoritative, as they ordered Ryan and Paul to remain on the ground. One officer approached James, his expression sharp with concern. "Are you all right, sir?" the officer asked. James gave a curt nod, his breathing steady but his jaw set with frustration. "I'm fine, but their leader got away," he replied, his voice edged with determination. The officer glanced toward the alley's exit, his hand reaching for his radio. "We'll establish a perimeter. Can you describe him?" James's eyes hardened as he replied. "Greg, mid-30s, wiry build, brown hair. He's dangerous and desperate." The officer nodded, relaying the description through his radio. Behind him, Ryan and Paul sat cuffed on the pavement, exchanging uneasy glances. Their earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. James turned his attention to them, his tone cold and deliberate. "You'd better pray the police find Greg before I do," he warned, his words striking like a hammer. Ryan paled, his gaze dropping to the ground, while Paul muttered something under his breath, his remaining defiance clearly beginning to fracture. At the mouth of the alley, Angela appeared, her wide eyes scanning for her father. "Dad!" she called, hurrying toward him. James's posture softened as he turned to her, offering a quick nod of reassurance. "I'm fine," he said firmly, though the tension in his voice lingered. Angela's gaze darted from the two cuffed men to the alleyway where Greg had disappeared. "Where's the other one?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. James's jaw tightened as he responded. "He ran." Angela hesitated, her face a mixture of fear and anger. "What happens now?" she asked. James glanced at the officers securing Ryan and Paul in the back of a squad car. "Now, we track him down. He won't get far," he said with quiet conviction. Angela studied his face, unsure but trusting. "You're going after him?" she asked. James placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Not alone. The police are involved now, but I'm not letting this go. Not after what they did," he said, his voice resolute. The officer who had spoken to James earlier approached again. "We'll bring these two in for questioning," he said, motioning to Ryan and Paul. "If you have any additional details, it could help us locate their leader." James's gaze shifted back to the two men. "Don't worry," he said, his tone unyielding. "They'll talk." The officer raised an eyebrow at James's confidence, but said nothing, instead turning back to assist his colleagues. As the alley began to clear, Angela touched her father's arm. "What if they don't catch him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James's expression hardened, his tone low and resolute. "Then I will." Hours later, the hum of activity at the police station filled the air, tense but purposeful. James and Angela stood in a small observation room, separated from the interrogation chamber by a pane of reinforced glass. Inside, Ryan and Paul sat slumped in their chairs, their wrists bound by cuffs and their expressions sullen and bruised. A watchful officer stood nearby, his arms crossed and his eyes sharp as they bored into the two men. Angela stared through the glass, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. "What if they don't talk?" she asked, her voice a mix of anger and frustration. "They will," James replied evenly, his focus never leaving the pair. "Cowards always talk when they realize they're alone." A detective entered the observation room, a notepad in hand and an air of exhaustion hanging about him. He nodded at James. "We've started questioning them," he said. "So far, not much. Tough guy act, you know how it is." James folded his arms across his chest, his gaze hard. "Let me in there." The detective frowned, his posture stiffening. "Sir, I understand this is personal for you, but this isn't some action movie. We have protocols, and we'll handle it." James's voice dropped, firm and unrelenting. "Your protocols won't work on them. They need to see the man who put them down. They need to know I'm not bluffing. I'll get what you need." The detective hesitated, glancing at Angela, and then back to James. "If you push too hard, we'll lose what little cooperation we have," he warned. James's reply was swift and unwavering. "I won't push too hard," he said, though his tone left no room for doubt. "But I'll get them to talk." After a long pause, the detective sighed and gestured toward the door. "Fine, but keep it clean. I'm watching." James nodded, his expression resolute, and stepped into the interrogation room. The faint creak of the door seemed to shift the atmosphere instantly. Ryan's head snapped up, his jaw tightening at the sight of James, while Paul shrank further into his chair, visibly uncomfortable. "You," Ryan muttered, his voice dripping with resentment. James closed the door deliberately, his steps measured as he approached the table. He didn't sit, instead towering over the men with an air of absolute authority. "Me," he said flatly, the single word enough to make the room feel even smaller. Paul fidgeted nervously, his cuffed hands clinking against the metal table. "We told the cops everything," he blurted out, his voice trembling. "We don't know where Greg went." James tilted his head slightly, his eyes boring into Paul. "Do I look like I believe you?" Paul swallowed hard, his gaze flicking to Ryan, silently pleading for support. "What do you want from us?" Ryan sneered, leaning back in his chair. "We're not snitches." James leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on the table. The sharp movement made both men flinch. "Not snitches?" he repeated, his voice rising. "No, you're cowards. Cowards who ran when it mattered most, leaving your leader to fend for himself. How do you think Greg feels about that?" "Shut up," Ryan snapped, his voice tinged with desperation. "You don't know anything." James's gaze sharpened. "Oh, I know plenty," he shot back. "I know Greg abandoned you the second things got tough, and I know you're sitting here, about to take the fall for every crime he's committed. So, tell me, what's your plan? Protect him? Go to prison for him?" Ryan's jaw tightened as he sat across from James, his fists clenching so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Paul, meanwhile, couldn't keep still. His leg bounced nervously under the table, and his gaze darted between James and the floor. The tension in the room was suffocating. "Don't even try it," James said sharply, cutting Ryan off before he could open his mouth. Straightening, James paced slowly, his movements deliberate as he let the weight of his presence settle over them. "You know exactly where Greg went. He didn't vanish into thin air. Guys like him always have a plan, a fallback, and you're going to tell me where it is." Paul's breathing quickened, his knee bouncing even faster. Ryan, on the other hand, tried to hold his ground, glaring at James with poorly veiled hostility. "We're not scared of you," Ryan spat, his voice shaking slightly but still defiant. James stopped pacing and turned, leaning in close enough for Ryan to feel the intensity of his presence. "You should be," James said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You've already seen what I can do. And if you think the cops are going to protect you when Greg finds out you cracked..." James let the implication hang in the air. "You're dead wrong." Ryan flinched, though he tried to cover it with a sneer. "You think you're so tough," he muttered, but his confidence wavered. James didn't blink. "I don't think I know." His voice was calm, measured, and cutting. Shifting his focus, James fixed his steely gaze on Paul. "Last chance. Talk." Paul hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Finally, his resolve crumbled. "There's a warehouse," he blurted out, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. "East side of town. He's used it before, when things got messy." Ryan's head whipped toward Paul, his expression a mix of betrayal and fury. "What the hell are you doing?" Ryan barked, slamming his fist on the table. "You're going to get us both killed." "I'm not going down for him," Paul shot back, desperation lacing his voice. "I'm not." James remained silent, letting the tension between the two simmer before stepping in. "What else?" he asked, his tone sharp. Paul glanced at Ryan, then back at James. His voice dropped to a shaky whisper. There's a bar near the docks. Quiet. Out of the way. He used to work there. It's another place he could be." Ryan groaned, slumping in his chair. "You're a coward," he hissed, his voice dripping with disgust. "Greg's gonna kill us both because of you." James leaned closer to Ryan, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You were already dead the moment you picked the wrong side." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Ryan said nothing, his jaw tightening as he stared at the table. James pushed back from the table and straightened, his voice calm and detached. "Enjoy your time in here. You'll have plenty of it." The metal door clicked shut behind him, and James stepped into the observation room where Angela waited. Her anxious eyes scanned his face, searching for any sign of progress. "Did they say anything?" she asked, her voice filled with urgency. James gave a curt nod. "A warehouse on the east side. A bar near the docks. It's a start," he replied, though the sharpness in his tone revealed he wasn't entirely satisfied. Angela exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, but the relief was short-lived as James's expression darkened. "They're holding back," he continued. "There's more they're not saying. Greg's not the type to go solo. He's too cocky. He's got backup." Angela's brow furrowed, her worry deepening. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before James could answer, the detective entered the room, his notepad in hand. "We've got units ready to check the warehouse and the bar," he said, his tone respectful yet cautious. "What's the next move?" James didn't hesitate. "Before we do anything, I'm going back in," he said, his voice firm. The detective raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll talk more? They've already cracked once." "They will," James said confidently. His tone left no room for argument. "Greg left them behind. They know it. It's only a matter of time before they turn on him completely. I just need to apply a little more pressure." Angela placed a hand on his arm. "Dad, are you sure? They're already on edge. What if they dig in their heels?" James looked down at her, his eyes steady and resolute. "They won't," he said simply. "Greg's their only protection, and he's gone. They'll break." The detective sighed, but gestured toward the interrogation room. "All right, but keep it by the book. We're still watching." James nodded sharply and headed back inside. The moment he entered, the tension in the room thickened. Ryan and Paul looked up, their earlier defiance replaced with unease. "What now?" Ryan muttered, slumping further into his chair. James walked slowly to the table, planting his hands flat on the cold metal surface. For a long moment, He said nothing, letting the silence stretch and weigh on them like a physical presence. Paul fidgeted, his leg bouncing under the table again, while Ryan tried to maintain a glare. "You gave me locations," James said finally, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "That's a start. But we both know Greg doesn't like working alone. So, who else is with him?" Paul's knees stopped bouncing. His gaze darted nervously to Ryan, who let out a bitter laugh. "Why do you care?" Ryan sneered. "You think you're going to take down his whole operation?" James didn't flinch. "I care because the next person he targets might not walk away as lucky as my daughter. Do you think this ends here? Greg's already planning his next move, and if we don't stop him, someone else gets hurt." Paul shifted uncomfortably, his voice weak. "Told you what I know. The warehouse, the bar. That's it." James's gaze sharpened. "You're lying. You've seen the others, heard their names. Tell me." Paul swallowed hard, staring at the table but said nothing. Ryan scoffed. "You're wasting your time. Greg doesn't trust anyone. He doesn't tell us everything." James straightened, his voice rising slightly. "Oh, he trusts someone. He wouldn't operate without a safety net. But go ahead. Stay silent. Protect him. Just know this. When he's cornered, he'll throw you under the bus." Paul's breathing quickened, his composure crumbling under the weight of the moment. There's one guy," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Paul! Shut up!" Ryan snapped, slamming his fists on the table. His voice was sharp, but there was an undertone of panic. "No, I'm done," Paul shot back, his voice breaking. "You saw what he did. He left us behind. Do you really think Greg cares what happens to us?" James stepped forward, his presence commanding but calm. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Paul hesitated, his eyes darting between Ryan and James before blurting out, "Eddie. He's connected to everything. Moving stolen goods, finding safe spots. Greg trusts him for the big stuff. If Greg's got a plan, Eddie's in on it." James nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "Where can I find him?" Paul looked down at his cuffed hands, his voice barely audible as he said, "He hangs around the docks, drives a black truck, never stays in one spot for long." James shifted his attention to Ryan, who was glaring daggers at Paul. "Anything to add?" he asked, his tone sharp. Ryan's jaw tightened, and he said nothing, his silence a defiant refusal. James straightened, his gaze unwavering. "Thought so," he said simply, stepping back. "You can sit here and stew, but Greg's already left you to take the fall for everything." Paul slumped in his chair, the fight drained from him. Ryan, however, remained rigid, his glare fixed on the table as James exited the room. Angela met him in the hallway, her expression a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "Did they tell you anything?" she asked. James nodded grimly. "Greg's got a guy, Eddie. If we find Eddie, we find Greg." The city's docks were bathed in the cold glow of moonlight, the shadows of towering cranes and stacked shipping containers stretching long and eerie across the ground. The air was thick with the scent of salt and oil, carried by a faint breeze that hummed through the still night. James stood at the edge of the water, scanning the expanse of the docks with sharp, calculating eyes. Angela had wanted to come, but James insisted she stay behind. This was no place for her. It required precision, experience, and a steely resolve that came from years of preparation. He knew she understood, even if reluctantly. Paul's tip about Eddie's black truck was all James had to go on, but it was a lead he was determined to follow. As he moved through the maze of warehouses and scattered containers, his eyes caught every flicker of movement, every shadow that seemed out of place. Near a stack of crates, James spotted a small group of men. Their cigarettes glowed faintly in the dark as they spoke in low tones, their postures tense. James approached them with measured steps, his presence drawing their attention. "Hey," James said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm looking for Eddie. Drives a black truck. You seen him?" The tallest of the group stepped forward, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Who's asking?" James's expression didn't waver. "Someone who needs to find him." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You're in the wrong place, old man. Move along." James's gaze hardened, his voice dropping an octave. "I wasn't asking for permission. Is Eddie here or not?" The man hesitated, his smirk faltering as James's steady stare bore into him. Finally, he sighed, nodding toward a dimly lit area near a line of shipping containers. Saw him over there about an hour ago. Don't know if he's still around. James gave a curt nod, his face unreadable. Thanks. The area near the containers was deathly quiet. The faint rustle of the wind the only sound. James moved silently across the gravel, his sharp eyes scanning the rows of stacked metal until he spotted it. A black truck, its engine faintly idling. Leaning against its side was a tall, wiry man, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. "Eddie!" James called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. The man froze, his head snapping up in surprise. His hand instinctively moved toward his jacket. "Who the hell are you?" Eddie demanded, his voice sharp. James stopped a few feet away, his posture calm but ready for action. "I'm here about Greg." Eddie let out a bitter laugh, tossing his cigarette to the ground. "Greg? What's he done now?" "You already know," James said evenly. "He's in trouble, and if you don't start talking, so are you. Where is he?" Eddie's lips curled into a sneer. "You think I'm just gonna tell you? Get lost." James stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "Greg doesn't care about you. He'll leave you behind the second things go bad, just like he did with Ryan and Paul. Do you really want to go down for him?" Eddie hesitated, his bravado cracking as his eyes darted around, searching for an escape. Finally, he let out a string of curses under his breath and leaned back against the truck. "He's got a spot," Eddie admitted reluctantly. "An old warehouse deeper in the docks. It's not on any maps. Just a place he uses when he needs to lay low." James's gaze stayed fixed on Eddie. "How many does he have with him?" "2, maybe 3 guys," Eddie replied bitterly. "Hired muscle. Greg doesn't trust anyone too much, but they're there to keep him safe." James nodded slowly. "Where exactly?" Eddie rattled off the location, his voice filled with resentment. "That's all I know," he added, shaking his head. "Take it or leave it." James stepped back, his expression unreadable as he absorbed the information. "You made the right call," he said simply, before turning and disappearing into the shadows. "Good call," James said, his tone icy and unyielding. "Stay out of this, Eddie. You don't want to end up in the crossfire." Eddie glared at James, his jaw tightening, but he didn't say another word. His silence was all James needed. Back at the station, James relayed the information to the detective, who immediately began coordinating a raid on the warehouse. Angela stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "You found him?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We've got a location," James confirmed, his tone firm. "But this isn't over." The detective clapped a hand on James's shoulder. "You've done good work. We'll move on the warehouse tonight." James nodded, his jaw set. "I'm going with you." "Dad!" Angela started, but James cut her off with a sharp glance. "This ends tonight," he said with finality, leaving no room for debate. The abandoned warehouse loomed against the night sky, its rusted metal walls and broken windows bathed in the faint silver glow of the moon. The air around it was heavy with tension, the silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of old metal shifting in the cool breeze. James stood at the edge of the tactical team, his sharp eyes locked on the structure. He could feel the weight of what was to come. The detective gestured toward the officers assembled nearby, their gear gleaming faintly in the moonlight. "We'll breach from 2 sides," he explained in a low voice. "Silent entry, sweep each floor, secure the perimeter. If Greg resists, we'll handle it." James nodded curtly, but said nothing. His clenched jaw spoke volumes about his thoughts on simply standing by. Angela had wanted to join him, but James had firmly insisted she stay behind. This mission required precision, discipline, and a cold focus, qualities he'd honed over years of experience. The team moved into position, shadows weaving through the darkened landscape. James followed closely behind the lead officer, his movements quiet and deliberate. Every creak of the building's rusted frame set his nerves on edge, though he betrayed no outward sign of unease. The first breach came with practiced efficiency. A battering ram smashed through the front doors, and officers poured inside, their flashlights slicing through the suffocating darkness. "Clear the left!" barked the lead officer, his voice low but commanding. James stayed close, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. The warehouse was a chaotic mess of debris, overturned crates, and rusting machinery. The team moved methodically, clearing each section with practiced precision. James trailed at the rear, his instincts finely tuned to every flicker of movement. They reached a narrow hallway where the faint sound of footsteps echoed ominously. The lead officer raised a fist, signaling the team to halt. The noise grew louder, and suddenly, two men burst into view, wielding pipes and shouting profanities. "Contact!" the officer barked. The first attacker swung wildly, his pipe smashing into the wall as the officer dodged. The second charged directly at James, his weapon raised high. James stepped aside with fluid precision, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting sharply. The pipe clattered to the floor, and James followed up with a swift strike to the ribs, sending the man sprawling. The first attacker lunged again, but was met with a baton strike from another officer. He crumpled to his knees, clutching his ribs as he was restrained. James crouched beside the man he'd taken down, grabbing him by the collar. His voice was low and deadly as he demanded, "Where's Greg?" The man glared defiantly, blood dripping from his split lip. "Go to hell." James tightened his grip, his tone dropping to an icy growl. "Wrong answer. Try again." The man hesitated, then finally spat out, "Upstairs. Top floor. That's all I know." James released him and motioned for the officers to secure both men. "Let's move," he said, his voice steady but urgent. The team advanced deeper into the warehouse, the air growing heavier with each step. The sound of more footsteps echoed ahead, and as they rounded a corner, 3 more attackers emerged. One, a burly man with a shaved head, charged forward, swinging a heavy chain. James ducked under the swing, seizing the man's arm and slamming him into a nearby wall. The chain fell to the ground, and James followed up with a sharp strike to the chest, knocking the wind out of him. The other 2 hesitated, their confidence visibly shaken. One of them bolted, but an officer tackled him to the ground. The last man, brandishing a knife, sneered at James. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." "Drop it," James said, his voice calm but unyielding. The man lunged, but James sidestepped smoothly, grabbing his wrist and twisting until the knife clattered to the ground. A quick kick to the back of the knee sent him down, where officers moved in to restrain him. James straightened, his breathing steady as he scanned the dimly lit corridor. "How many more?" he asked an officer. "Unknown," came the tight response. James glanced toward the staircase ahead, faint light seeping through cracks in the walls above. He could feel the weight of what awaited him at the top. "Let's finish this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The air was thick with anticipation as they approached the staircase. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last, each one carrying James closer to the confrontation he'd been building toward. The warehouse had grown eerily silent, save for the faint hum of machinery somewhere in the distance. At the base of the stairs, James held up a hand, signaling the team to halt. His instincts screamed that something wasn't right. The stillness, a deceptive calm before the storm. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but obeyed, their weapons trained on the shadows above. James's grip tightened on the railing as he whispered, "Stay ready, he's up there." James signaled the officers with a sharp gesture, the tension in the room thick and electric. "Spread out," he instructed, his voice low but commanding. "Form a tight perimeter around the stairs. We don't know what's waiting up there." The team moved with precision, their weapons at the ready as they began their ascent. Each creaking step seemed to echo in the oppressive silence, amplifying the sense of foreboding. The air was heavy with dust, the faint beams of moonlight streaming through shattered windows, highlighting the debris-strewn floor of the upper level. As they entered the shadowy space, the faint scuffle of movement reached James's ears. He gestured for the team to hold, his sharp gaze scanning the area. Stacks of crates loomed in the gloom, their disarray providing plenty of hiding spots. James's pulse quickened. Greg was close, watching and waiting for his moment. "Move in," James ordered, his tone calm and controlled. The officers spread out, their flashlights slicing through the dimness as they searched every corner. Then James caught a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between 2 piles of crates. Without hesitation, he moved toward it, his body low and purposeful. Greg stepped out of the shadows, his eyes wild with fury. A crowbar gleamed in his hand as he sneered, his voice rough with rage. "You should have walked away," he spat. "You're just as pathetic as the rest." James didn't flinch, as Greg swung the crowbar with ferocity. Blocking the first blow with his forearm, James felt the reverberation jolt through his body. Greg swung again, faster and more erratic. But James was ready. He sidestepped the attack and countered with a powerful strike to Greg's midsection. Greg staggered, but his resilience pushed him forward. He threw a wild punch, which James ducked under with practiced ease. Seizing the opportunity, James grabbed Greg's arm, twisting it behind his back with enough force to slam him against the wall. "You're finished," James said, his tone icy as he pinned Greg in place. Greg gritted his teeth, his breath ragged as he struggled. With a burst of desperate energy, he pushed off the wall, throwing James off balance. The two men tumbled to the floor, grappling in a fierce struggle. Greg managed to position himself on top, the crowbar raised high above his head. "You're not stopping me!" Greg bellowed, swinging the weapon down. James reacted instantly, raising his arm to block the blow. Pain shot through him as the crowbar struck, but he used the momentum to shove Greg off and reverse their positions. Pinning Greg to the ground, James delivered a precise knee to his chest, leaving him gasping for air. Greg's eyes burned with rage, his voice dripping with venom. "You think this is over? You're no better than me. Weak, useless." James leaned closer, his voice deadly calm. "I'm nothing like you. I don't hurt others to feel powerful." Greg let out a bitter laugh. His breath labored. "You're wrong. You think you've won, but you don't know who you're dealing with." James tightened his grip, dragging Greg up to meet his piercing gaze. "I know exactly who you are. A coward who preys on others. And it ends now." Greg's defiance flickered as he glanced toward the officers standing nearby. Instead of fighting back, he smirked, his voice filled with spite. "You're right, it's over. But this isn't the last you'll hear of me." James held his gaze, unblinking. "We'll see." With one final, decisive move, James twisted Greg's arm behind his back and forced him to the ground. The officers moved in swiftly, cuffing Greg and hauling him to his feet. As they dragged him toward the stairs, Greg twisted his head to glare at James one last time. "You'll regret this," he sneered. "I'll make sure of it." James didn't react, his steady presence unshaken as he watched Greg being led away. The hunt was over, but a nagging unease remained. Greg's cryptic words echoed in his mind, hinting at secrets yet uncovered. The warehouse had fallen silent, the air heavy with the aftermath of the struggle. James stood motionless in the center of the upper floor, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Pain pulsed through his arm, but his focus remained sharp. The detective approached, his flashlight cutting through the dim corners of the room. "We've got him, Parker," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "That's what matters." James nodded, his eyes sweeping over the scattered crates and overturned furniture. "It's not everything," he said. "Greg's been operating for too long to keep everything in one place. He's got stashes, connections. There's more here." The detective frowned, motioning for the team to begin a full sweep of the area. "If he left anything behind, we'll find it." James moved to a shadowy corner where a stack of crates caught his attention. The faint outline of something hidden beneath a tarp piqued his curiosity. Pulling back the covering, he revealed a concealed stash, papers, cash, and other items Greg hadn't managed to take with him. "Found something," James called, his tone grim. The detective stepped over, his flashlight illuminating the cache. "Looks like you were right," he said. "Let's see what we've got." As the team began cataloging the evidence, James allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Greg's reign of terror had ended. For the first time in months, he felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Greg's network was vast, his schemes deeply rooted. The work to dismantle it completely was only beginning. James tugged at the tarp, revealing a trove of stolen items, electronics, jewelry, and other valuables piled haphazardly. His expression hardened as he muttered, "Stolen goods." He gestured to the detective, who crouched beside him with a grim nod. "This lines up with the recent robberies," the detective said, his tone laced with satisfaction. "This stash is enough to lock him in." As James continued his search, his foot brushed against something metallic. He crouched again, lifting a rusted floor panel. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment containing several small notebooks. Picking one up, James flipped through the pages, scanning columns of names, locations, and dollar amounts. He turned the book toward the detective. "A ledger," James said. His voice clipped. "This is big." The detective's eyes widened. "Names of buyers, accomplices, maybe even clients. This will bury him." Outside, the night air was cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension of the warehouse. Greg sat in the back of a squad car, his face twisted in fury. As James emerged from the building, Greg's sneer deepened, his voice rising to a shout through the car's window. "You think this is over, Parker?" Greg bellowed, his words venomous. "You don't know who you're messing with. I've got people. You'll see." James approached the car, his steps deliberate. His voice was calm, controlled. "You've got nothing. Your people abandoned you the second you went down. Now everything you've done is catching up with you." Greg's sneer faltered, but he forced a bitter laugh. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a washed-up soldier playing cop. This doesn't change anything." James leaned in closer, his gaze unflinching. "You're right. I'm no hero, but I don't need to be to stop someone like you." Greg's glare burned into him as the squad car's engine roared to life. The vehicle pulled away, its red and blue lights fading into the night. The detective approached James, one of the ledgers in hand. "This is enough to dismantle everything Greg's built," he said, flipping through the pages. "He's tied to more than just robbery. Human trafficking, illegal arms deals. It's all here." James's jaw tightened. "Make sure every name in that book faces justice." The detective nodded. "We're assembling a task force. This could take months, maybe years, but you've given us the start we needed." Not long after, Angela arrived at the scene. She rushed to her father, relief etched across her face as she threw her arms around him. "Dad," she whispered, "you're okay." James returned the embrace, his stoic demeanor softening slightly. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. "It's over." Angela pulled back, her worried eyes searching his. "Is it really? What about everything else Greg was involved in?" James glanced at the detective, who held up one of the ledgers. "We've got the evidence. They'll follow the leads." Angela nodded but frowned. "And the people he hurt? What happens to them?" James's expression hardened. "We do what we can, starting with returning what was taken." Over the following hours, the team cataloged the stolen items, matching them to open cases. Victims were contacted, and their possessions prepared for return. Each phone call felt like a small step toward restoring what Greg had taken. A series of small but meaningful victories. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, James stood outside the warehouse, watching the horizon shift from gray to gold. Angela joined him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed him one, her expression both weary and hopeful. "Thanks," James said simply, taking the cup and staring at the awakening city. Greg's reign of terror was over. Though James knew the fight wasn't finished, this was a victory, a moment of peace he allowed himself to savor. The next few days at the station were a flurry of activity. Greg's ledgers became the centerpiece of a growing case. Officers worked tirelessly, cross-referencing names and transactions with unsolved crimes. The web of Greg's operation unraveled, revealing connections to trafficking, weapons deals, and laundering schemes. In the station's conference room, James sat with the lead detective. A map of the city spread out before them. Red pins marked warehouses, stash houses, and meeting points, scattered like a plague across the city. "This is bigger than we thought," the detective said, shaking his head. "Greg wasn't just running robberies. His network ties into trafficking rings, illegal arms, and laundering. He had his fingers in everything." James leaned forward, his gaze intense. "And his men? Ryan? Paul? Eddie? What are they saying?" The detective smirked grimly. "Ryan and Paul cracked the second they got in. They're terrified and throwing Greg under the bus to save themselves. Eddie's tougher, but even he's caving. They're all trying to make deals, but the DA isn't in a forgiving mood." "Don't let them walk away from this," James said, his tone firm. "They knew what they were doing." "They won't," the detective assured him. We've got enough to put them away for decades. That afternoon, James stood outside the courthouse. The crisp air carried the murmurs of reporters and onlookers as Ryan and Paul were escorted from a police van. Their heads hung low, their once brash attitudes dissolved under the weight of their impending sentences. Angela stood beside her father, her arms crossed. "They don't look so tough now," she said quietly. "They never were," James replied evenly. "They just thought no one would hold them accountable." Angela looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "And now?" "Now," James said, his voice steady, "they face the consequences." Angela's brow furrowed as she watched Greg being led out of the courtroom. "Do you think they regret it?" she asked softly. James's gaze didn't waver. "People like them don't regret the harm they cause. They regret getting caught." Angela was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What about Greg?" James's expression darkened, his voice steady. "Greg's worse. He doesn't regret the damage he's done. He only regrets losing control. That's all he's ever cared about." Inside the courtroom, the trial resumed with unrelenting focus. The prosecution wasted no time, presenting a detailed breakdown of Greg's criminal enterprise. Photos of the stolen goods recovered from the warehouse flashed on screens alongside pages from the ledgers James had uncovered. The prosecutor's voice rang out, steady and resolute, as she addressed the jury. "This man built an empire on the exploitation of others," she declared. "He preyed on the vulnerable, using fear and manipulation to maintain his power. But today, the evidence will show that his reign is over." Ryan and Paul were the first to testify, their pale faces and trembling voices betraying the weight of their guilt. Under the prosecutor's careful questioning, they recounted how Greg had drawn them in with promises of fast money and maintained control through threats and fear. Ryan shifted in his seat, his voice unsteady. "Greg, he always had a plan. He told us who to target, how to act, and if anyone stepped out of line, he made sure they paid." Paul nodded vigorously, gripping the edges of the witness stand. "At first, it was just robberies, but then it escalated. The trafficking, the weapons deals. It was all him. Greg called every shot." From his seat at the defense table, Greg sat motionless, his expression cold and detached. But James, watching him from across the room, saw the subtle signs of tension, the tight clench of his jaw, the way his fingers dug into the arms of his chair. When it was the defense's turn, Greg's lawyer tried to cast doubt on the testimony, suggesting Ryan and Paul were exaggerating to save themselves. But the mountain of evidence, the ledgers, the stolen goods, the testimony of the victims, was too damning to dismiss. Hours later, the prosecutor rose for her closing argument. She turned to face the jury, her voice unwavering. "This case isn't just about one man's crimes," she began. "It's about the lives he shattered and the fear he spread. Greg Daniels thrived on the belief that no one could stop him. But today, we have the power to prove him wrong." As she spoke, James felt a quiet vindication. This wasn't just about his daughter or even himself. It was about every life Greg had disrupted, every family torn apart. The judge adjourned for the day, announcing that sentencing would follow after the jury's deliberation. James stood as the courtroom began to empty, his gaze lingering on Greg. "He looks like he's falling apart," Angela observed, watching Greg's stiff posture as officers escorted him out. "He's lost everything," James replied. "Control, power, that's all he cared about." Angela tilted her head thoughtfully. "Do you think he knows it's over?" James's lips pressed into a thin line. "He knows." The courtroom was packed the next morning, the air heavy with anticipation. All eyes were on the judge as she took her seat, her expression stern. "You may be seated," she announced, her gavel striking once. The prosecutor stood, her voice firm as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, the state requests the maximum sentence for Greg Daniels. His leadership in organized theft, human trafficking, and weapons smuggling, paired with his lack of remorse, warrants no leniency. The victims of his crimes deserve closure, and the defendant deserves the full weight of the law." The defense lawyer rose next, his tone measured. "Your Honor, while we respect the jury's decision, we ask the court to consider my client's difficult upbringing and the systemic failures that contributed to his path. A life sentence without parole would be excessive. James felt Angela stiffen beside him. He placed a steady hand on her arm, but couldn't hide the clench of his jaw. Greg had every chance to stop. He muttered. He chose not to, because he didn't care about anyone but himself. Angela nodded, her gaze locked on Greg. The judge's gavel struck again, silencing the murmurs in the gallery. She leaned forward, her voice resolute. This court acknowledges systemic challenges, but the actions of Greg Daniels were deliberate. He exploited others for personal gain, showing no regard for the lives he destroyed. This is not a case of circumstance. It is a case of choice. The defendant chose to harm, and now he will face the consequences. The room held its breath as the sentence was read. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The weight of the decision rippled through the gallery, some weeping quietly, while others exhaled in relief. James remained still, his gaze steady as Greg was led from the courtroom. The former gang leader's defiance had drained away, replaced by a hollow, distant look. As the doors closed behind him, Angela turned to her father. "It's over," she said, her voice soft but certain. James nodded, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. For him, yes, but for the people he hurt, the work is just beginning. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, the hum of the city resuming its familiar rhythm. Angela stood beside James, her arms crossed as they watched the reporters scramble to document the moment. "They don't look so tough now," she said, nodding toward Ryan and Paul as they were led into the building. "They never were," James replied. "They just thought no one would hold them accountable." Angela looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "And now?" "Now," James said, his voice firm, "they face justice." The judge's voice cut through the heavy air of the courtroom, her tone firm and unyielding. "This is not a case of a single bad decision or a momentary lapse in judgment," she began, her gaze fixed on Greg. "This is a pattern of deliberate, calculated harm. You had countless opportunities to walk away, Mr. Daniels. Instead, you chose to build an operation designed to exploit and harm others for your own gain." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And now you must face the consequences." Taking a deep breath, she delivered her verdict. "Greg Daniels, this court sentences you to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 30 years. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some spectators gasped in relief, while others nodded solemnly. James remained impassive, his sharp gaze fixed on Greg, who sat motionless, his face a mask of fury. The sentences for Ryan and Paul followed soon after. Their cooperation with law enforcement earned them reduced sentences, but the judge's tone remained severe. "Ryan Thomas and Paul Harris," she declared, her voice steady. "Your willingness to assist the prosecution has been noted. However, this does not absolve you of your involvement in these crimes. You each played a significant role in carrying out the defendant's plans." Her eyes narrowed as she addressed them directly. "This court sentences you both to 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 7. Consider this your chance to reflect on the lives you've impacted." As the two men were led away, their heads hung low, James watched them disappear without a flicker of sympathy. Their choices had led them here, just like Greg's. Outside the courtroom, Angela stood beside James as the crowd began to disperse. She glanced up at her father, her voice quiet. "It's done. For now," James replied, his tone measured. Angela frowned, searching his face. "What do you mean?" James gestured toward the prosecution team, still packing up files. "There are more names in those ledgers. People Greg worked with, people who profited from what he did. This was just the first step." Angela nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "And the victims? The people who lost everything because of him?" James's jaw tightened, his voice steady. "We do what we can to help. The stolen goods are already being returned, but some things can't be replaced." That evening, James and Angela returned to the station one last time. The detective greeted them at the front desk, his face lined with exhaustion but satisfaction evident in his tone. "Greg's not getting out anytime soon," he said, handing James a folder. "And we've got teams chasing down every lead in those ledgers. With luck, we'll dismantle the rest of his network before they can regroup." James flipped through the file, his sharp gaze scanning the details. Good. Make sure none of them slip through the cracks. The detective offered a faint smile. You can count on it. Thanks for everything, Parker. We couldn't have done this without you. As they stepped outside, the crisp night air wrapped around them. The city seemed almost serene, its streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Angela looked up at her father. Do you think it's really over? She asked softly. James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. It's never over. Not completely, but for now, we've done what we can. And that's enough. Angela smiled faintly, slipping her hand into his as they walked into the quiet night, ready to face whatever came next. At home, the stillness was palpable, the kind that settles after days of chaos. Angela sat on the couch, a mug of tea cupped in her hands, while James stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. It feels strange, doesn't it? Angela finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Knowing it's all over, at least for now. James turned from the window, his expression unreadable as he crossed the room to sit in the armchair opposite her. Leaning forward, he rested his elbows on his knees. Strange isn't the word I'd use, he said, his tone steady but tinged with weariness. Necessary, maybe, but not strange. Angela studied his face, searching for answers. You've done things like this before, haven't you? James nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. In a way, in the military it was different. Cleaner, orders, objectives, a clear enemy. This was messy. Angela set her mug on the coffee table, her brow furrowing. Do you think they'll ever understand what they've done? Greg, Ryan, Paul, any of them? James let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. Some might. Ryan and Paul, maybe. They're cowards, not monsters. They followed Greg because it was easier than standing alone. But Greg? He shook his head. Greg doesn't have it in him. To him, this was just a game he lost. He'll sit in that cell thinking about how to get back at the world, not about the lives he destroyed. Angela's voice wavered as she asked, It's so unfair. He gets to live, even in prison, while everyone he hurt has to pick up the pieces. James's gaze softened as he met her eyes. It is unfair, but that's why we do what we can to make it right. Returning the stolen goods, dismantling his network, it doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. Angela shifted, tucking her legs beneath her as she studied him. Do you think about the victims? The ones we never met? The ones who didn't even know they were on his radar? Every day, James admitted, his voice low. People like Greg thrive because they think no one will stop them. That's why it matters to stand in their way. Angela frowned, her voice barely audible. You make it sound simple, like all we have to do is stand up and it'll make a difference. James leaned forward, his tone firm but gentle. It's not simple, and it's not easy, but it's necessary. You can't change the world overnight, Angela, but you can start with one fight, one stand. That's how it begins. Angela nodded, her expression resolute as the weight of his words settled over her. Together they sat in the quiet living room, the promise of a better tomorrow lingering in the air. Angela offered a small, heartfelt smile, her eyes glistening with emotion. You sound like a superhero, she said softly. James chuckled, the sound low and warm as he shook his head. Hardly, just someone who refuses to look the other way. For a moment, silence settled over them, companionable and calming. The weight of their conversation hung in the air, but began to ease, replaced by a quieter understanding. Angela broke the stillness, her voice thoughtful. What happens now? James rubbed his hands together slowly, the motion deliberate. Now, we wait. The police have the ledgers. They'll track down the rest of Greg's network, and we help where we can. That's all we can do. Angela's gaze lingered on him, steady and searching. And you? She asked. What are you going to do? A faint smile played on James's lips. I'm going to sit here, finish this tea you made me, and try to remember what it feels like to breathe without carrying the weight of the world. Angela laughed softly, the sound light and soothing. That sounds like a good plan. James's expression grew more serious as he studied her face. And you? How are you holding up? Angela hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around her mug. I'm okay, I think. It's just a lot. Knowing how close I came to... She stopped, her voice catching as her thoughts overwhelmed her. James reached over, resting a firm but gentle hand on her arm. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady and grounding. "That's what matters." "I know," Angela said, her voice growing steadier as she met his gaze. "But it doesn't feel like enough. I want to do more. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." James nodded slowly, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "Then you will. You already have the most important thing you need, the will to make a difference. Everything else will follow." The clock on the wall ticked softly, the sound blending with the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the next room. The world outside seemed distant and peaceful, as if the chaos of the past week had been nothing more than a bad dream. Angela cradled her mug in her hands, the warmth seeping into her palms as she mulled over his words. "Do you think they'll really shut down the rest of his network?" she asked, her tone thoughtful. "They will," James replied with certainty. "It'll take time, but the police know what they're doing. Greg's empire is already falling apart, and there's no one left to hold it together." Angela nodded, her expression softening into something hopeful. "Good." James leaned back in his chair, a faint smile curving his lips. "Good." As the night deepened, the two sat together, their conversation fading into a comfortable silence. The fight was over, for now. They both knew there would always be more challenges ahead, but they also knew they would face them together. And for tonight, that was enough.